Let them finally be heard. How integrating a multiplicity of voices may lead to more inclusive, peaceful, and sustainable societies is the title of the talk of our next speaker, head of the scientific department of the Vest-Agder-museet in Norway, Kathrin Pabst, who is also a project leader of the project Identity on the Line. Kathrin, please.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for putting together the program as you did. The last talk was a perfect introduction, actually, or start for my talk, because what I'm going to talk today to you about is all about healing. Healing of individuals, of families, of family relations, and of societies. And it's a very, very demanding work, and care is needed for the people involved and for the museum professionals. I have a short structure. I'm a German. I always have structures. I have 3 structure points here. I will give you some input about what I'm talking about, some examples. I will talk about trauma, silence, and intergenerational transfer. And I will argue for why museums should not only, and I think it was great presentations earlier today, but I want to take it much further than what we have heard today, or not further, that is wrong, because it was very long in the art discussion. But I think that all of us, and I'm sure many of you, inside of you, somehow struggle with things which you never thought a museum could help you with. And I would argue for, yes, museum and cultural institution can help you much more than you think. So, let's see if I manage to convince you. You see 2 signs here. I will start to introduce an international project called Identity on the Line. It's co-funded by the European Union, and we just won, as several others here in the audience, or those of them who have presented, the European Museum Academy Award for our approach. The international project, which is the starting point for our research, which I want to present, is an international large-scale project between 6 cultural history museums and 1 university. And what my colleagues and I have done is that we have taken migration processes, wars, which have not been they have not been worked through in the countries. They are not talked about. They are secrets. They're a part under the surface, under the topics you normally address. Everybody knows about it. Many have stories of this in their family, but nobody dares to address it. And we took 7 of these migration processes, 1 in each country, and started to look at the similar signs in all of these processes. Very shortly, in Norway, we looked at the long-term consequences of the German occupation. 500,000 German soldiers came to Norway for 5 years and left again. And until now, almost 80 years later, 30-year-old don't dare to talk about what has happened, because the war for 77 years ago still affects their life so much. In Denmark, we have worked with the long-term consequences of migration from Greenland to Denmark. A lot of micro-racism today still. We are working with the Sami minority in Sweden. We are working with the population exchange after World War II in Poland. We have worked with the long-term consequences of the Holocaust for Lithuanian women, and all our work is based on in-depth interviews, face-to-face interviews, one-to-one. And you can imagine that my colleague, who has conducted interviews with women who are now 90 years plus and have been in the concentration camp and didn't talk about it before, had quite a hard time doing so. And we have 2 countries from the Balkan, Slovenia and Croatia, who are working with the long-term consequences that politics, of course, change, borders change, your rights changed, you have to leave your hometown, your countries. And what was special with our work, what we haven't seen before so clearly in other countries, is that we have interviewed those who have experienced, I want to say trauma, no? difficult happenings in their life which have been so tough or related to shame and guilt. Maybe you have done something which you couldn't cope with later on. Maybe you have experienced something which you were not able emotionally or intellectually somehow to work through. We have interviewed those time witnesses, their children and their grandchildren. 3 generations, often from the same families. And what we found, I just have to give you some overview how quite huge our material is. We have conducted in this project 164 interviews, each 2 to 15 hours long. We have collected objects, photographs, and so on, videos, audios, and we have a lot of dissemination channels which I am not going to present now. You can find it online. We have also some spin-off project, which means that in total the research results I'm going to present to you are based on more than 200 in-depth interviews who were really long and solid, I would say. I want to give you a short example of what we are talking about. Just 3, 4 quotes. This is from Lithuania. Our colleague asked, "When did your children start questioning you?" It is already a slightly painful question in that sense that I didn't tell them anything. My children didn't ask me. Now, as in the last years, when the Jewish community emerged during the years of independence, this topic started to be spoken more about. When they told me some years ago that they had felt the pressure all the time, I said to them, "I didn't say anything to you. I didn't tell you any stories." "No, you didn't tell us, but we felt it." And this we see again and again and again in our material. The time witnesses think if they don't talk about what has happened, for whatever reason, maybe they want to spare their children, maybe they just want to forget. Many said they just wanted to forget. The children and grandchildren are always affected. The untold doesn't go away. The trauma doesn't go away. It has to be addressed. But many are not aware of it, and this has huge consequences. The next, and this is a descendant of a soldier who came to Norway. This is a descendant of someone who did something in Norway and who never recovered of what he did. She said, "Something happened in Norway during the war, something terrible that was going to leave its mark on my father more than anything else. Something so strong that he was never willing to talk about it. Something that traumatized him so profoundly that it affected our entire family, even us 4 siblings who have never experienced war." Very short, a lady who has had, as a 16-year-old girl, fallen in love with a German soldier and had been expelled. She had to leave her family, she had to leave the society, and she never recovered. And she told me, "Nobody wished me welcome when I came back from Germany, where I had left my German husband behind. My brothers and sisters had worked for the resistance, and one of my brothers had been killed as a result of this. The other siblings who have survived treated me like air. In the village I was not existent." And this lady told me, to be able to cope, I had to shut down all my feelings. I never talked about what has happened, but I never forgot my love to my husband. Her daughter, now 62 years old, told us, she was the 62-year-old, was the first talking to me, and she said, "I have been lonely my whole life. I have had the feeling I am not a part of the society my whole life, and I had no idea why. And only now, with over 60 years, I got to know that my mother had been married to a German during the Second World War and had been excluded from the local society. Now I understand my feelings." And the last one, a lady who was abused by her father, massively abused for her father, and the only person who could save her when it was too bad was her grandfather, her living grandfather, the father of the father. And she told us, "You know, I never thought that my beloved grandfather could have done anything wrong because he was the best person I knew. But somehow, some years ago, when I heard in the radio that a new archive had opened and they had stories about the people who had been convicted and sentenced to jail after the Second World War, I had just this weird feeling I had to call them. And she called the archive and she got to know that her grandfather had over 200 pages of documents, what he had done. He had been to jail. She had no idea. And it turned out that when he came back from jail, he was such a violent man and abused her father so profoundly that she interprets it in the way that she said, because his violence, my father became violent, and I experienced what I experienced. And we have seen this a lot in our material. If you do not know how to cope with difficult behavior, difficult feelings, it might result in violence, which affects your children and grandchildren if it's not stopped somehow. So this goes from one generation to the next, and we have to talk more about it. I come back to why museums are important in this thing. Looking at our total material, we can see that there are polarities we find in all over 200 interviews. All the people we have talked to from all three generations are somehow trying to find themselves in keeping to silence, being more open, feeling vulnerable, feeling outside. We have seen that there are feelings and behaviors transferred from one generation from the next. Anger, guilt, shame, exclusion, racism. Many positive feelings? No. If there is trauma which is not solved, something is happening in the families. Not only in the individuals, that is bad enough, but also in the families, in the family relations, and in the societies. And therefore, museums have to act. I just want to take a very short stop and say something about a trauma as such. Every one of us can experience a trauma, and many of us does during their lifetime, okay? We can suddenly lose someone whom we very much love. We can have an accident, we can be ill. There are many possibilities for us to experience a trauma. When it comes to war and forced migration and extreme historical events, and it's important that I'm talking about historical events here, which affected many people at the same time in a similar way, okay? If this is involved, the traumas are very close to each other. There are many traumas in a very short period of time, and this really marks you. If you have a trauma as an individual, you can and should, and many times you should go to a psychologist to get help in a good manner. But when it comes to collective traumas which so many people have experienced, that many have experienced somehow the same, nobody talks about them either, and then they are going on and going on and going on. I think here museums can come in. When museums as historical institutions address, not only as art museums, but also as cultural history museums, address collective traumas, they can help very much many people, and I want to argue why. Before I do so, I want to say something that I'm not misunderstand. As I said, many of us, most of us, somehow will experience a trauma in our lives. Of course, not all are going to be ill because of trauma. Generally speaking, it's 1/3 of the people who have experienced trauma, massive traumas, who are experiencing, or where you can see clinical symptoms. 1/3 is coping fine, totally okay, and 1/3 has a reduced life quality. But it's not only what a trauma does to you. If the trauma leads to something which is not addressed, to something untold, it can be passed on to the next generation and thereby also affect your children and grandchildren. I don't want to spend much time on this, but there are 3 ways how a trauma can be passed on from one generation to the next. It's through behavior. Even if you do not talk about something, you can sense that something is there. You can sense how you should react to certain things, how you should behave to certain things. So this is one way a trauma can be passed on. It can be directly passed on to you while you're in your mother's womb. And new research with Holocaust victims has also shown that in such extreme situation as being in the concentration camps, there can be installed a kind of marker on your DNA that reminds the body of the stress you have experienced. And this marker, studies from Israel have found also in the 3rd generation, in the grandchildren of the Holocaust survivors. This means that if the 3rd generation of people who have experienced extreme stress, a generation have experienced extreme stress, themselves experience a trauma, their reaction will be much stronger than the reaction normally would be, because the body remembers the stress, which is somehow there inside you. Okay, very easy. I'm not a biologist, but we have worked closely with psychologists and people who know much more than I about it. So, how and why is integrating a multiplicity of voices important for more healthy societies? First, I want to tell you a little bit about at least my knowledge about museums, and I would say it's quite huge. I have worked in many museums in several countries for some time and worked with these topics. Normally you have the mainstream stories. You have all the stories which somehow fit in the current historical frame, the knowledge we have. These are the stories you know, and those people who come to the museums and find themselves in these stories think this is the whole truth. Meaning that all the people who do not belong there, who have stories which have not been shown in the museum, they feel that they somehow are on the outside. They do not fit in, and they think that they are all alone with their stories and their experiences. That they think there are no others who have it the same way. And that is, of course, a mistake. So one thing museums have to do, a duty to do, is to collect personal narratives, subjective stories, in addition to creating a more objective frame, and of course to revise the historical frame, that more people feel seen and heard in a museum. But in addition, we have a challenge if we, for example, get a personal narrative. We listen to someone from the first generation, from the time witnesses, who have a story which we know cannot be true from other material. Then we have a challenge when it comes to subjective narratives versus a more objective truth. Unfortunately, I do not have time to talk about this much more now. I have to move on to the 4 levels of importance of this topic for us museums, for us museum employees. And one more time, before I do so, want to point your attention to the differences from the time witnesses, the first generation, which we define as adults during a historical event, which has affected many. You have their children and you have the grandchildren. The time witnesses often choose, for psychological reasons, because it's too tough, because the shame is for tough, the experiences have to be too hard, they have been exposed for such an injustice that they can't bear it, they just want to forget it. They often know what has happened. They choose not to talk for whatever reasons. The children do not get information which they all the time can sense. The second generation is the most vulnerable generation in our research results. The second generation, the children of the time witness, they do not dare to ask the tough questions because they sense that something bad will happen if they ask too much, but they suffer in silence. And if they do not manage somehow to find out of what has happened, it turns also to the third generation. All these people from all these generations are individuals, and all of them, both the time witnesses who have experienced something, also the children who experience the untold, the not spoken about, the silence. This is also an experience, also a long-term consequence of war and forced migration. And the grandchildren who can feel that something in their family is under the surface and they don't know what it is. They don't get proper answers from their parents or grandparents. They all have a need to be heard and included. They demand, everybody of us, all of us demand somehow, we need that someone takes our needs so important that they give us the answers we need to find out identity-related questions. And if we don't get these answers, it's really difficult for us. So caregiving is a very large aspect here. We have also a very important theory, it's called theory of recognition, of a German philosopher called Axel Honneth, which is really useful. So all humans have a need to be recognized and loved for who they are by their closest relatives, and they need to get answers. And if they don't get the answers from the family members, a lot of things happen. One thing is disturbed family relations, really disturbed family relations, which is a health issue, not only for the individuals, but also for the families. but they will also react in a way that it affects their children and the surrounding societies. The second level are the people who have experienced the same. Let's say you go to a museum and you only find the mainstream stories. You only find the good stories, the positive stories from your region, but you don't find the stories which somehow are related to your family. You do not feel included. You feel like an outsider, and you don't dare to tell your story because you do not want to be the only one who comes forth with the story. But if you find your story somehow at the museum, you start talking yourself. You start sharing yourself if you feel safe, if you have trust to the people who talk to. Here we have training of museum professionals, theoretical and practical knowledge about how to do this work. But this I will talk about tomorrow in a masterclass, so not now and here. But there are a lot of things to think about. But if you come to a museum and you find a similar story as the one you have experienced yourself, something starts to happen. Also because you find answers to questions you have had, but maybe never really understood how important it was for your own life. And many of our informants have expressed the wish to help others as motivation to share their stories, because they said, we have suffered so much, we want to share our stories, that somehow we are the other stories which haven't been shown before, and others see themselves in our stories. The third level is the society as such. Because imagine that there are how many people of us having somewhere inside reaction patterns, feelings that are related to not knowing, sensing but not getting the answers you know. You do not have the whole picture, you do not really understand. So if we, museums, could provide more knowledge about all the different kind of feelings, reaction patterns, what has happened, political decisions, if we could do so, many more people would be somehow feel respected, they would feel heard, they would feel seen, even if not their perspective would be the most important, maybe in the official public discourse, they would at least have the feeling that they are recognized for their pain. That really makes a difference for societies. They can really become more peaceful. If museums dare, to a larger degree than today, to really address the tough secrets, the tough things which are in the societies. And I know here in these countries are many of the untold stories. They are under the surface. Many know about it, but nobody would address it, because somebody has to start, and it's just a painful thing. To think about it yourself, to think about what it did to your family, and to understand the scope of the untold and what has happened, really to go into it. It's really hard. So if museums could be even better and systematically approach what they know is under the surface, working together with informants in an ethical, good way, in a healthy way, together with health professionals, to get the stories from the people who want to share but need a good and safe space to do so, and use these stories to tell the visitors what has happened, to tell the second generation and the third generation why the first generation acts like it acts. I really believe that we are on our way to healing. For individuals, for families, for societies, you have to know, you have to understand, to be able to forgive your parents who did something you couldn't accept, to forgive silence, to forgive that you suffered yourself because you never were respected and got the answers you needed. And the last thing, of course, our common history understanding have to be based on a multiplicity of experiences. One thing is the objective facts, what has happened, but another thing is how you experienced, how the people who have been there experienced what has happened. And that also have to come forth, and that has to be a part of our history telling. Thank you.
Oh. Thank you, Kathrin. This is an excellent presentation, positive within the challenge and the difficulties of trauma. Very, very powerful. I have an online question that I will start with, and then if somebody wants to take the mic, is by Natasha Glaraki. She says, congratulations. By which method did you trace the 200 interviewees throughout Europe
Could you please say it again?
By which method did you trace the 200 interviews?
How we collected it.
How you collected,
yes. Yes, we have worked together as a team in Identity on the Line for 3 years now, and in the beginning we have worked closely with psychologists, and we have set up an open interview guide, meaning that we had a certain order of questions we wanted to ask, and we used all the same interview guide. We went through the same questions, but we always adjusted it to the situation. So sometimes we had to go a little bit forth and back. But we have all used the same questions, the same approach, and we have worked this approach with psychologists. And what I'm also going to say tomorrow a little bit more in the master class, the gut feeling of you who is facing the informant then and there is very important. So you can't always go back to a paper and say, and now I have to ask you this or that. Of course, when it comes to trauma and emotionally so difficult subjects like war and forced migration and what it did to your family and your parents, what it affected you, you have to be very careful. And we have also been trained, actually, by psychologists how to conduct the interviews.
I was going to say, yeah. And do we have any? I was ready to ask my own questions, I'm sorry. Please, Dina, yes.
Dina, you're a cultural manager. Thank you. Yeah, super powerful to hear about the danger of a singular story, because it's not something we hear very often, and kind of how you use identity-informed practice to reconcile the history of the country you come from to the history of the country of asylum. I was wondering if it's worth, if you think that by diversifying the staff of a museum or a cultural organization, we're going to be able to share better those stories, so we invite those people in to have more, I don't know, stronger positions within our organizations. Thank you.
It's the difficult question, because now we can, if you're, you know, I have always said, when in Norway we had this, I'm a German living in Norway, so when in Norway the politician said, now you have to diversify your staff, now you have to have people from different countries. This is one perspective, but this traumas, it doesn't matter from which country you come. It doesn't matter from, it is very, very personal, very, very personal, and everyone can have it in a country, in a society, everywhere. And what I only can say is that my colleagues and I, all of us, have somehow a personal relation to what we are talking about, somehow. And this is maybe an advantage, but also a big disadvantage in that in that manner that it is emotionally so hard to work on something like that when you at the same time process your own suddenly appearing feelings. So, and sometimes you don't know why you're so interested in it. So just very short, I'm a German. I have been obsessed with secrets my whole life. I have worked with it for over 20 years professional, to find out 3 years ago that my grandfather was an NS soldier. Of course I knew it, but I didn't know the scope because nobody talked about it. And my family, refugees, they lost everything. Nobody ever talked about 1 year on the run. And terrible things have happened. I found in the history books, but I never got any information. But I had no idea when I started this work. So it's a very personal process for many people, and that makes it very tough. And everyone who's working with this have to take incredible care of themselves. This is crucial. And a lot of training, practical information could be given, but I don't have the time now.
One question relating to this last point. I guess people have agreed, will you publish the material? Are they ready to face the truths, so to speak?
This is, if you go on the internet, you can find, we have movies, we have exhibitions traveling through Europe, we have a lot of dissemination. Everyone who have experienced, most of our informants want to be anonymous. So that is very important to know. And we have been extremely ethically careful in how we took care of the letters of consents. We did only what they asked us to do, never anything more. So we have been extremely respectful, and you have to do it, to their stories. And when you look at the whole material, all this over 200 stories, you can see that those people who have experienced that they have been excluded from the social life from the local societies because they did something which was not accepted somehow. They want to be anonymous. Still, 30-year-old people today who have grandparents who have been punished for what they did or felt shame or felt guilt for something what happened, and the grandchildren still today do not want to be recognized. 3 generations later, that's quite strong, I think.
But they still trust you with the information. They just don't want to make it public, which is...
Once again, please.
They do trust you with the facts and the information. You as the project...
The museums are, okay, this I could talk also more about. Museums are very trustworthy institutions. And the second you come into a museum and you meet a museum professional, you decide, am I willing to share my story or not with this person? So here's very much going on in the interaction between the museum professional and the informant. Yes, they trust, but you as a museum professional has been so respectful that if the informant comes back to you later and say, sorry, I just can't bear it, I can't see my story somewhere, you have to be willing to take it away as much as possible. If it's digitally published, it's difficult, but you have to think about it in advance and be honest to the informants. The second I have your story and you have accepted it, I can take it away from the exhibition, but not from the digital content.
Thank you very much, Kathrin. Thank you so much. I will have to stop our discussion here.